Good evening. On behalf of the director of the Polish, of the Museum of the History of Polish Jews POLIN, Professor Stała, I would like to warmly welcome you all and our guest, our distinguished guest today from Israel, Professor Natan Sznaidera. And let me say a few words about him. Although I think that we will listen to more detailed story during the lecture. Professor Sznaidera, his family came from Poland, although he was born in Germany. Then he, later on, he emigrated to Israel and studied at the Tel-Aviv University and at the Columbia University, where he did his PhD. And after his PhD, he taught at various universities in America, Israel, and Germany. And just now, Professor Sznaidera is working in Munich, at the university in Munich, and also he's a professor in the academic college Tel-Aviv Yafo in Israel. His field of research is, I would say, globalization, memory, and Holocaust. And there will be a talk about this today. So the floor is yours.
Good evening. Could you turn off the light a little bit? Otherwise, I feel I would have to sing in this big lecture hall, if it's possible. Okay. Awesome. Great. No, my light. I actually meant my light. Okay. Thank you very much for the introduction. It's really a wonderful, wonderful hall here. And I'm sorry I have to speak and not to sing and to dance. Like it would be appropriate in this lecture hall. Before I start my lecture, I would like just to say a few words. Also because this lecture is in English, I cannot speak Polish, even though my name is Polish. So you may have asked yourself why my name is Polish, but I cannot speak Polish. The fact is that my parents are... Okay, yeah. Can you hear me good in the end? Okay. That my parents are actually from Poland. My mother was from Kazimierz, my father from Radom. And they left Poland in 1946 for obvious reasons. I don't have to go into that. And I'm not sure how they would feel if they would know that I would speak Italy, because they really never looked back. And I hope somehow they will forgive me for that. Okay, let me start now to talk about what I want to talk about, which is Europe, memory, Holocaust, and issues I'm working on with in my work. It seems to me that Europe, at the beginning of the 21st century, looks for some shared cultural imageries, providing some cultural backbone to the crisis-ridden currency of the euro. Is it true, as some critics claim, that there is actually no reality that deserves the title of Europe? That it is merely an idealized term for an elitist illusion that does not stand up to critical questioning? And is it not a remarkable sign of nostalgia and introversion that in the age of globalization, the European Union is predominantly preoccupied with its own affairs and is still attempting to define its own political constitution? And this is even more confusing if we take into account that the attempt to create the current formation called Europe was actually launched after the Second World War in a politically conscious act as the antithesis to nationalistic Europe and its physical and moral devastation. Europe is actually a creation of memory. But if this is the case, then we may want to ask ourselves if this creation is more like a vampire coming to life only after its death, or rather a zombie, a creature whose life has no end, a body without consciousness who lives on. One of the intellectual answers to this quagmire is the theoretical concept of cosmopolitanism, which I would like to introduce to you here, trying to preserve both the universal cosmos and the particular polis. It is based, among others, on revulsions against the Holocaust and World War II, Stalinism, colonialism, and other forms of repression. The trap, of course, that we may find ourselves in it is, of course, the need to understand that nationalists create absolutes out of relatives, while cosmopolitans seek to relativize all absolutes. But the point of cosmopolitanism is to see that the universal and particular exist in a dialectical relation. They do not oppose each other. They define and influence each other. This is a crucial point in the cosmopolitan enterprise. In my view of cosmopolitanism, the universal means what it does because the particulars are its background, and where the particulars mean what they do because the universal is their background. As a result, when one changes, the other changes. But importantly, neither disappears. Universalism and particularism need to be thought out together. This means, for instance, that the strength of global culture does not entail the weakness of national culture. On the contrary, the strength of national culture is what produces cosmopolitan culture. The mutual influence of nations to the institutions of globalization produces both sides of cosmopolitanization, the central but growing core of common values, and the globalized variations of local meaning, something often forgotten by nationalist discourse. Now let's try to translate these rather theoretical reflections into a politics of memory. The European divide also cuts through the contents of what needs to be remembered and what needs to be prioritized. Western European leaders, for instance, and intellectuals, have repeatedly invoked the seminal role of the memory of the Holocaust as a foundational event for such a shared past. If anything characterizes the memory of the Holocaust at the present time, it is the multiplicity of meanings and their continuous evolution. But what exactly do we mean when we speak of the memory of the Holocaust? And very shortly, some people view the Holocaust as the culmination of the history of anti-Semitism, some see it as the apogee of the history of racism, and some consider it even a crime against humanity. The differences among these points of view are subtle but crucial. Anti-Semitism is suffered only by Jews. Racism, a broader category, can be experienced by anyone who is different or other. Crimes against humanity are broader still and may even be considered crimes against the human condition. Now, throughout the 1990s, Holocaust memory inscribed itself into context of traumatic national memories in Latin America, in South Africa, in Rwanda, in Australia, and in East Asia and other places. Memories of local historical traumas as diverse as apartheid, the desaparecidos, the disappeared of the Latin American dictatorships, the stolen generation in Australia, the comfort women in Korea, and the Rwandan genocide have been discussed in relation to the Holocaust for several reasons. The UN Genocide Convention that provides the legal framework for prosecution of present-day genocide and massive human rights violations sprang, amongst others, from the Holocaust. And the Holocaust has been turned into a paradigm for genocide studies. As the best researched case of genocide, the Holocaust provides models of study and discussion for other cases of genocide, ethnic massacres, and human rights violations. The vast Western media have produced a multiplicity of representations from documentaries and video projects to films adapted from Holocaust-related fiction. All of this has led to the current globalization of Holocaust discourse and a new politics of memory in transnational constellations. And the scholars of memory, like Michael Rothberg, has convincingly shown in his study of multi-directional memory, or myself in the study of cosmopolitan memory, the memory of the Holocaust does not take away anything from other memories. This is not a zero-sum game. This does not mean, of course, that we should or can expand and broaden the Holocaust to each and every injustice we encounter. On the other hand, if there ever was a traveling, cosmopolitan, or a multi-directional memory, it is the memory of the Holocaust. And as scholars of memory, we can show that the memory of the Holocaust does not have to exclude those who were historically not part of it. If we truly think that all cultural memory must travel, we can illustrate this claim even further. I just want to give you a small example. I would like to quote from the document Building a House of European Memory, a project of the European Parliament to open in the near future in Brussels. There it says, and I quote, "The break of civilization of the Shoah is the beginning and the nucleus of the European discourse of memory. For a long time, states were silent about their failings. In the meantime, the recognition of the Shoah as a singular crime against humanity has become the negative reference point of European self-consciousness." Now, if you look at that text, and I just gave you a little excerpt of it, here the Jews are only seen as victims, as the negative reference point of European self-consciousness. We are left with nothing except an undifferentiated, moralizing discourse about victims, which again results, in my opinion, in thinking without differentiation. And as we all know, the emphasis on victimhood is never a good starting point for politics. However, this scenario can only be the beginning for a look at the prospects for a new Europe, how to relate to the memories of the Holocaust and the cosmopolitan promises attached to them. With the Enlightenment imperative hovering as a cultural deep structure over the enterprise, this universalizing this universe, so to speak, has a long tradition of rejecting particular attachments as anachronistic. In its contemporary variant, the particular is frequently perceived as an impediment, if not an outright antidote to the cosmopolitan project. Thus, parochial attachments to ethnic and national belongings are being often blamed for Europe's incapacity to move forward. Thus, I want to introduce to you a new concept, the concept of Jewish memory, into the discussion about memory and Europe in the global age. Looking at Jewish memory, we discover a different kind of memory, a memory on the move, transcending time and space. This kind of memory is very often based on experiences originating spatially, for instance in Eastern Europe, not necessarily so, but moving and traveling from there to Western Europe, to the USA, to South America, to Latin America, to South Africa, to Latin America, and even to Israel, while at the same time being able to travel back to Eastern Europe. It is my argument that what can be called cosmopolitan, multidirectional, or traveling memories are posing challenges to the ideas which bind history and borders tightly together and open up the possibility that this is not the only possible means of social and symbolic integration. Jewish memory is, however, not restricted to Jews alone. This is not about ethnic exclusiveness. I do not want to allegorize Jews as the exemplary other. That would be too simple, even though I know this is like a little bit of risky business talking in a Jewish museum. Other groups, identities, and histories inhabit the world in which we all live, and we should take seriously the insights that their own particularity might offer to our understanding of cosmopolitanism. Jewish culture was not only mixed with other cultures, it was itself a mixture of cultures. In a certain sense, its cosmopolitanism lay in Judaizing the mixtures of cultures it absorbed. It gave them a unifying cast without negating them. The experience of diaspora, of life in exile, is the clearest example modernity offers of a sustained community life that does not need a territorial container in order to preserve its history. Memory, in this case, has the potential to destabilize space. This is not an obvious point, not even in a Jewish museum. And if we need to take into account that Zionism, like other national movements, do not accept that. Clearly, Jews are not a sharply differentiated, internally homogeneous, and externally bounded group. This is rather fantasy than reality. Clearly, this is a very complicated topic which needs to be disentangled here. We are talking about the tension of Jews as sovereign citizens of their own country versus Jews as a diasporic or exiled people. As you well know, after the French Revolution, European Jews started to feel the strain between citizenship and loyalty. Within the bounds of citizenship, Jews needed to find, determine, and maintain their Jewish identity. As we will see, it was this tension between citizenship and humanity that troubled many Jewish intellectuals until this very day, even before the Holocaust and especially after. One of the defining moments in that debate that took place in the French National Assembly during the French Revolution occurred over the question whether Jews could be citizens of the new French nation or should be treated like all other foreigners. Stanislas Marie Adelaide, Comte de Clément Tonnerre, a liberal aristocrat, argued for the inclusion of Jews and Protestants into the nascent French nation. On December 23rd, 1789, he gave a speech that became constitutive of Jewish modernity after the French Revolution, in which he argued that citizenship should not be based on ethnicity, nationality, or culture. And I will give you a short quotation from his speech in the French Assembly. Every creed has only one test to pass in regard to the social body. It has only one examination to which it must submit, that of its morals. It is here that the adversaries of the Jewish people attack me. These people, they say, is not sociable. But they say to me, the Jews have their own judges in law, and I respond, that is your fault, and you should not allow it. We must refuse everything to the Jews as a nation, and accord everything to Jews as individuals. This has become, of course, like an iconic sentence. Pas de droit pour le juif qui est des nations, et tous les droits pour le juif qui est individuel. We must withdraw recognition, and I continue quoting, from their judges. They should only have our judges. We must refuse legal protection to the maintenance of the so-called laws of their Judaic organization. They should not be allowed to form in the state either a political body or an order. They must be citizens individually. But some will say to me, they do not want to be citizens. Well then, if they do not want to be citizens, they should say so, and then we should banish them. It is repugnant to have in the state an association of non-citizens and a nation within the nation. In short, sirs, the presumed status of every man resident in a country is to be a citizen. Jean-Jacques Rousseau sends his regards, of course. These words are at once hope and curse. The Jewish exile can be over. Assimilation and civic equality can become keys to the end of exile. Jews can stop being wanderers. They can become equal citizens. This promise, especially in Western Europe, created the contradiction between nationalism as a universal force and the attraction of super and supranational modes of belonging, the modern form of life in exile. Clermont told the Jews that there was no room for particular wills within the general will of the nation. This was a truly revolutionary insight and has remained one of the integral aspects of being European. In fact, the European project of unity is based on it. Europe's universal pride allowed Jews to be part of it as equals, to become integrated as Germans, French, Spaniards, Norwegians, even Poles, but not as Jews. France is exemplary here in that it became the classic locus of the translation of emancipatory ideas into politics. Jews were supposed to be like everybody else and not a nation within a nation. Or as Heinrich Heine once put it, Jews are like everybody else, just a little bit more so. Emancipation did indeed emancipate. It released the Jews from the confines of their community and had them enter modernity as individuals who, like all other citizens, had to rely on the protection of the state. But from this moment on, Jewish difference became a modern problem that would have enormous political consequences in later centuries. And this was not only true for the Jews. The French Revolution did indeed try to dissolve all corporations in order to construct its new universal state. Citizenship promised to end the Jewish diaspora and bring the Jews home, not as Jews, but as citizens. Thus, citizenship became part of the solution to the Jewish problem. And this has consequences as well for the question of memory. Thus, the question remains, can a Jew assimilate? Or is the idea actually an oxymoron? Because the more you assimilate, the less you are a Jew. And if you feel like a Jew, then you're apparently not assimilated. So you have this paradox which cannot be solved. But let's go back for a second to the beginnings of the European Union. Universalizing tendencies, ignoring those Jewish life worlds, were present right from the beginning when the post-war European project started. Thus, a short look of a meeting in September 1946 in Geneva exemplifies a universalizing trope that characterized most post-war responses by European intellectuals. It was also affected by a series of conflicting universalism. The first conference of European intellectuals in 1946, that was exactly the year that my parents ran away from Poland into the Western zone to feel safe amongst the Germans, as the book by Ruth Gay so pointedly puts it out. And that same year, an intellectual conference was organized by Julian Bender under the heading The European Spirit, l'Esprit Européen. It was held near the site of the former League of Nations, as though the European intellectuals were trying to resurrect the spirit of the League. The participants included, amongst others, Karl Jaspers and Georg Lukács, who would remind the participants of the future division of Europe into Western and Eastern blocs. The event began with a lecture by Bender opposing nationalism in Europe. He pledged to work for a post-national Europe, a Europe that would serve as a civilizing force in the world. If you like, the intellectual beginnings of the later coming European Union. The conflicting versions of universalism were represented by Karl Jaspers and Georg Lukács. Jaspers' view of a cosmopolitan Europe was based on the humanistic values he saw as the political antithesis to nationalism and the devastation it had unleashed. For him, Europe should become a cultural project in which the values of the Enlightenment could be preserved. Jaspers' lecture emphasized individualism, liberalism, Christianity, and liberty. His cosmopolitan Europe had no geographical boundaries, but rather was a locus of values. Its origins were not only in Europe, but also in China, in Europe, starting around 800 BC, when all of the world's religions were founded. Jaspers called this the actual age, the time when myth ended and history began. It is also the beginning of transcendental thought, which demands a higher law and preserves a tension between this world and the other, transcendental one, a tension, Jaspers argued, that enabled freedom to flourish, but had now been abolished by totalitarian societies. Let's remember that Karl Jaspers was also the dissertational advisor of Hannah Arendt, and her book, The Origins of Totalitarianism, was very much influenced by these ideas. The axial age, with its world religions, Judaism, Hellenism, Hinduism, Buddhism, Confucianism, and Christianity, guided humankind into modernity. Jaspers meant that Germany could be part of the free world once again, in the sense that European culture was the culture of Homer, Sophocles, Plato, Aristotle, Virgil, Dante, Shakespeare, Goethe, Cervantes, Racine, Molière, Raphael, Michelangelo, Rembrandt, Velázquez, Bach, Mozart, and Beethoven. Shalom Aleichem is not in that list. He also tried to distance Europe from the victorious allies, the United States and the Soviet Union. In his view, Europe needed to steer its own course, in many ways predating later visions of core Europe steering its own course once more. European memory is here first of all understood as cultural memory, a unified spiritual idea, an idea which is of course still with us. Just think about the European project of the German philosopher Jürgen Habermas. Jaspers' opponent at the conference, Georg Lukács, was invited as an important Marxist theorist, since Soviet intellectuals refused to attend. He belonged to the Communist Party elite in Hungary at that time. In Geneva, he presented another version of European cosmopolitanism. Lukács at once attacked Jaspers' existential concept of liberty and dismissed his thinking as bourgeois pessimism, which Lukács argued could be even held responsible for fascism. Lukács proposed an alliance of progressive and democratic forces in Europe with the Soviet Union, which he saw as the embodiment of European democracy. He favored continuing the alliance of 1941 as a means of advancing the revolutionary spirit. His stance was as cosmopolitan as Jaspers, but it represented the cosmopolitanism of Marx and Rousseau, of the French and Russian revolutions. The division in Geneva, the fight between Jaspers and Lukács over the soul of an imagined cosmopolitan Europe, reflected the positions of the two sides in the emerging Cold War. What was striking, however, at the Geneva conference was the neglect of the Jewish experience. And it didn't matter in that respect that Lukács was Jewish. It was as though the disappearance from Europe was a fait accompli, that the intellectuals in Geneva would not waste their breath discussing. And this was a striking omission, in my opinion. We can see that same omission in Jaspers' very important book for the memory of guilt in post-war Germany. His book, Die Schuldfrage, The Question of Guilt, which was published in 1946, became a founding document of the new Western Germany and its subsequent attempts to come to terms with its past. He argued that the post-war world needed to be based upon a universal cosmopolitanism, a world without others or borders. He sought to refute the notion that Germans collectively were guilty for the crimes committed. Distinguishing between criminal, political, moral, and metaphysical guilt, Jaspers established the view that to condemn people as a whole violates the claim of being human. Of no less interest in Jaspers' articulation of European cosmopolitanism was his failure to make any reference to the Jews in their extermination. A step certainly not taken for lack of personal empathy or courage, since Jaspers' loyalty to his Jewish wife cost him his job and almost his life. One can detect a comparable dynamic in post-war legal deliberations about Nazi war criminals during the later 1940s. The Nuremberg War Crimes Tribunal introduced legal precedents that address these human rights violations. The American understanding of what was then called Nazi atrocities and not yet the Holocaust, which framed the Nuremberg trials, was universalistic. Neglect of the fate of the Jews provided the backdrop for Nuremberg's universalistic message. Civilization was the victim, Nazi barbarism the perpetrator. The Jews were there, but they stood in for humanity as a whole, as formulated in the formula crimes against humanity. This is of course connected to the new order after World War II, the origins of the current European formation. The framers of the new order after World War II saw the Depression and the years leading up to the war as a matter of economically warring blocs whose tensions grew bigger and bigger. They not only intended to provide a legal order to which all belonged, they also intended to create a world economy to which all belonged, in which cooperation between societies became progressively deeper, i.e. the euro. They foresaw a world in which cooperation would be the fundamental feature of international affairs. Since problems could be dealt with legally, there would be no arms races since they were counterproductive. In such a world, they reasoned, tyrannical governments would not last. Their people would get rid of them as this system was getting over historical trauma. This was the redemptive moment in the hopes after World War II. This approach was premised on there being no pariahs. On this view, all countries could cooperate in their common interest, for they reasoned, had not World War II shown that. If they could do it, then anyone could do it. If they could do it for such high stakes, they could do it for lower stakes as well. And the longer they cooperated, the more the system would converge. And the more they converged and were governed by law, rather than violence, the more they would converge with the ideas embedded in human rights. Indeed, a nice dream, a wonderful dream, even an imperial dream. But not only a dream, but a view which very much underlined the new order, even if the old politics of sovereignty continued. And in social theory, this is reflected to the view that the Holocaust has become a prison through which modernity is reassessed, typically via the association of modernity with progress and Enlightenment ideals, or via the envisioning of barbarism as the flip side of these concepts. Neither perspective can say with certainty whether barbarism is a breakdown of civilization or whether it is inherent in modernist rationalization and bureaucratization itself. The functionalist view of the Holocaust, which conceives of barbarism as an inherent or even inevitable outcome of modernity and enlightenment, has taken center stage. But from this perspective, the idea of the Nazis as perpetrators is dissolved into metaphors, in which the real culprits are not concrete people, but modernity, bureaucracy, or just human beings. This structural approach to understanding Nazi crimes is the same attitude as at the roots of a new European cosmopolitanism, in which the Holocaust becomes a monument to the omnipresent modernization of barbarism. Just have a look at the Holocaust Memorial in Berlin, where this is truly symbolized also aesthetically and architecturally. But let me take another route here. I would like to suggest a Jewish-rooted cosmopolitanism as the historical and analytical prism through which to understand European processes. Current manifestations of post-national, multi-ethnic, and transnational ties have of course long been an integral part of the Jewish experience. Similarly, the Jewish origins of the notion of diaspora reject the necessity of geographically defined nations and rootedness. Other dispersed peoples attribute a similar negative status to diaspora. Contemporary usages of the term, however, suggest that diaspora can be perceived as an alternative to the metaphysics of the nation and be celebrated as an existential condition that includes attachments and belonging in non-territorial terms. Diaspora is thus the prototypical cosmopolitan condition, although the point is not here to valorize diaspora, but rather to address its current normative validation. And one can clearly observe this at looking at some examples of Jewish historiography. Now, this is not reawakening the old important debate between memory and history in Jewish history. I don't want here to rekindle what Chaim Yosef Yerushalmi has done so beautifully in his own work. My point is to show that even when at times of nationalized historiographies, Jewish history, in order to be understood nationally, had to be read transnationally. One example is from another Jewish museum that I can give you, the Jewish Museum in Skopje, in Macedonia, which I visited like a few months back. In the Jewish Museum in Macedonia, you don't have the history of Macedonian Jews. What you have is the history of Sephardic Jews crossing the borders between Greece and Macedonia, which were basically enemies. But from a Jewish point of view, there's no distinction between Skopje and Saloniki. They are the same. But for Greek and Macedonian nationalists, the distinction between Macedonia, or the former Yugoslavian Republic of Macedonia, and Greece are as large as one can only imagine. So again, the point is to show that even in times of nationalized historiographies, Jewish history, in order to be understood nationally, has to be read transnationally. Rather than suspending the notion of deterritorialization or letting it linger, suspended in vaporous conceptual space, I want to shortly introduce two of the most important Jewish historians of the 20th century to make my point. I mean Shimon Dubnov and Salo Baron. This is the same Salo Baron who gave Hannah Arendt her first job after her arrival to New York and became also a close friend and associate. This was also the same Salo Baron who was an expert witness during the Eichmann trial about the unrecoverable loss of East European Jewish life and culture, which he testified to during the Eichmann trial in 1961. They not only provide historical perspective, but their biographies are lived transnational ones. One born in 1860 in what is today Belarus, the other born at the end of the 19th century in Tarnów, Galicia, then part of the Habsburg Empire. Both were skeptical of modernity and its emancipatory side effects on European Jewry. For them, pre-modern formations that provided minority group rather than individual rights ensured cultural autonomy, while emancipation was predicated on assimilation. For Dubnov and Baron, territory came secondary to the need for group autonomy, foreshadowing an important feature of cosmopolitanism. But this is not only relevant for specialist historians, but their concern for Jewish minority politics is mirrored in a transnational interest in the status of Jews in imperial contexts, where rights-based autonomy trumped the assimilating demands of nation-states associated with emancipation. Both Dubnov and Baron thus engage their readers with a non-territorial conception of collective identification. And they do write history from a Jewish perspective. They practice Jewish history and not history of the Jews, and this is a very significant and important distinction. It is of course striking to note that the first was killed in Riga with the beginning of the German occupation, while the second spent his life and career in the United States. We talk here about two kinds of hope which also can be found in Jewish history. One for a goal that transcends history, and the other for improved conditions and survival within history. Politically and historically, this kind of historical perception came to life for a brief moment after World War I, when Jewish ethnic minority diplomacy emerged at the Paris Peace Conference that proposed a deterritorialized political vision of rights. This vision became constitutive for a number of Jewish intellectuals who were actively involved in articulating Jewish identity prior to the Holocaust. Holocaust. Leo Motzkin is just one example, but there are many, and amongst them Hannah Arendt, of course. These political activists and thinkers advocated a form of cultural autonomy that would guarantee minority rights beyond national boundaries. The political cultural understanding of minority rights, championed by Baron and other autonomists, had mostly been relegated to the margins of the larger stream of European history. As you may know, one of the demands of Leo Motzkin and the delegation of Jewish diplomats in Paris was to create a European Jewish passport that Jews can have all over Europe. Demanded also a seat at the League of Nations, a Jewish seat at the League of Nations. Of course, these demands were outright rejected. This is the history, or the memory, if you like, which served as a backdrop for Arendt's book on the origins of totalitarianism, maybe one of the most excellent examples of a productive mixture of memory and history. As you know, the treaties at the end of World War I gave 60 million people states of their own and turned another 25 million into minorities. The fall of the pre-war empires forced national minorities to search for solutions to their vulnerable post-imperial status. Their rights were not protected by national states, but were supposed to be protected by the League of Nations, which sought to come to terms with national aspirations without surrendering to them completely. International law was supposed to check nationalism. That was the idea. As the victorious powers assembled to make peace in Europe, news of massacres in Eastern Europe reminded everyone that peace and stability in the new successor states depended on protections offered to their minorities. Jewish life worlds had been shaped by pre-modern empires, and their integration as a collective into the modern nation state was more than precarious. Jewish communities had been dependent on the needs provided by the multi-ethnic variety of the now extinct large empires, and were decisively challenged by the exclusionist politics of the 1920s and 30s. In that post-imperial context, a pervasive sense, echoed in the later works of Arendt, for instance, emerged that the nation-state could not protect members of a different nationality. The limitations of this international system and the failures of the League of Nations to hinder the catastrophe of World War II led then to the creation of the United Nations. And this important episode in Jewish and European history has of course disappeared from sight almost completely, and rightly so, overshadowed by the Holocaust. It seems clear today that we talk about the epochal significance that of the Holocaust both for Jewry and the new European self-understanding. This has been thoroughly established in the field of memory studies. Memories of the Holocaust were primarily shaped by the perspectives of who was remembering, Jews or non-Jews, what was being remembered, concentration camps or occupation, for instance, and where the remembering took place, Western, Central, Southern, Eastern Europe, for instance. In spite of this variety, the dominant tropes of European Holocaust remembrance are characterized by a universalism that comes at the expense of the recognition of Jewish particularism, and Jewish minority politics has disappeared altogether. Remember that quotation I gave you from the House of European Remembrance, where Jews are exclusively seen as victims and not as politically active. The Jews were caught in a double bind because they were thought of as too particular to be universal citizens, and they were thought of as too universal to transcend the bounds of their transnational belonging to be particular citizens. And this is happening to memory exactly the same way. So despite the tendency to privilege the mostly Western European conception that situates the origins of the memory boom during the 1980s, a concept that developed in response to late reactions to the events of World War II, it should not be mistaken for the sort of preferred form for how the past should be commemorated. What is officially remembered is not identical to the memories particular groups carry. A unified European memory should recognize that divided memories result inevitably from different experiences. I guess as scholars of memory, we do recognize the constant realignments of temporality in memory as an integral part of our work. European expansion has the potential, it doesn't have to, but it has the potential to ignore the divergent historical memories of existing and prospective EU member states. Faced with such non-recognition, new member states in the East and the South seek legitimacy for their particular experiences and memories, most notably by displacing the Holocaust with their own victimhood under Stalinism, even if it downplays the apparent anti-fascist founding moment of the European Union. Similar processes take place in the South, as the Western European presumption that memories of the Holocaust would provide the foundation for a shared European identity has clashed with the memory politics of post-Stalinism or even post-Francoism. State-imposed commemorative practices have become the subject of fiery debates, contributing to the renationalization of European memories. I think this is a very clear point we can observe. This fragmentation of memory regimes makes a singular and unifying notion of European cosmopolitanism highly controversial, even as a binary discourse celebrates Western universal post-nationalism and condemns the persistence or return of ethnic, religious, and or national particularism in the East or anywhere else. Underlying this debate is a continuous balancing of competing conceptions of victimhood. And I said before that victimhood never makes for good politics. National memories tend to privilege their own victims. In comparison, cosmopolitanized memories complicate matters by contributing to an emerging duality as nations must engage with their status as victims and their role as perpetrators. In this context, cosmopolitan memory claims for itself the very idea that we are all victims. It implies a conversion experience, as the exposure to trauma involves a redemptive departure from the original traumatic experience. Under a particular system of victim consciousness, you need a distinction between perpetrator and victim. This is absolutely necessary. Under this, there can be no victim without a perpetrator, and conversely, to call someone a victim is to instantly accuse someone else of being a perpetrator. However, in the universal conception, the concentration on perpetrators undercuts the whole idea of victim consciousness. All victims are deserving ones. We are not supposed to distinguish between the respective sufferings of groups, and every attempt to privilege one group over another is met with strong resistance. Leveling the field of suffering also has unintended consequences, as it challenges beliefs about who the perpetrators and who the victims are. And I guess I don't have to tell you, you live in a place where you have a wonderful example about this. Thus, to move from a Jewish to a more generalized minority perspective, a historical analysis may shed light on current xenophobic sentiments against immigrants, for instance, which may be just as much a hallmark of Europeanness as its purported cosmopolitanism. To be sure, anti-immigration sentiments can be found in all corners of the world. However, Europe is distinguished by its failure to come to terms with difference, which was facilitated by the effectiveness of Holocaust in eliminating its primary other. In theory, Europe remembers the Holocaust. But the depth of that memory may be doubted when many Europeans seem to have forgotten that their continent was home to other outsiders well before the arrival of today's Muslim minority into Europe. Inverting previous multicultural ideas and policies that celebrated particularism, many European states and intellectuals now reject, for instance, Islamic traditions by portraying them in their most particularistic extremes. Thus, to conclude, Jewish history is not only the object of history, but also becomes a mirror for understanding the complex consolidation of European memory. And the memory of the Holocaust will continue to move between particular Jewish history and universal human rights, thus to return to our first point, being vampire or zombie at the same time. Thank you so much.
Are there any questions? I have a very short one. Is Israeli history and memory is Jewish?
You really want me to get into that now? I don't think so. I don't think so, but this is a long discussion. I think that the dominant Zionist discourse, which aligns very well with other nationalist discourses, is exactly the rejection of Jewish diasporic past. It connects to perceived mythical times of sovereignty before the diaspora. But the negation of diaspora has become like the founding, the constituting belief of Israeli nationalism. That's why I think that these are not aligned on the same way. And there's developing, of course, but this really would lead us into a completely different discussion. People think about Jews outside of Israel and Jews inside of Israel as the same kind of ethnic category. But over the last decades, they developed a new formation, a new social formation, which can be called Israeli Judaism. And Israeli Judaism is completely different from Judaisms we found outside of Israel. Even though many Jews outside of Israel would like to realign with Israeli Judaism, and many Jews inside of Israel would like to realign with diaspora Judaism, which you have then the diasporization of Israeli politics and the Judaization of diaspora politics. But I mean, this really would, I think, take us far away from what we... Okay, any more questions? Yeah, please.
Oh, thank you.
Okay.
In a couple of days, Armenians worldwide will commemorate 101st anniversary of Armenian genocide.
Mm-hmm.
How do you feel about that Israel doesn't recognize it as such? Thank you.
There's a moral issue and there's a political issue. How I feel about it is completely irrelevant. The moral issue is that it should be recognized, of course. That's the moral issue. The political issue are Turkish-Israeli relations. Turkish-Israeli relations sometimes trump moral issues. So if you distinguish between politics and morality, the non-recognition of the Armenian genocide in Israel has less to do with the claim that this is the only true genocide, but in my opinion has much more to do with the very difficult balance the Israeli state is trying to establish with the Turkish state. But I mean, what I think personally is really not of any kind of relevance here.
I have a question and a little bit an example of an exercise of imagination. Could you imagine a discussion between Karl Jasper and George Lucas 70 years later? Will they found perhaps a platform to understand two respective perspectives. It seems 70 years ago impossible to combine, but perhaps today they could find more elements which will relativize the respective positions. Thank you.
Yeah. Interesting question. I think, you know, that Lukács was a smart man. I mean, 70 years later, I said, how could I have been a socialist? It's like, how did this happen to me? Sort of like, I think he would have realized, you know, that, you know, liberal democracy might be the better way to go. But what do I know? I mean, he was, he had strong, I mean, he really had strong Stalinist tendencies in his thinking, and maybe he would have, he looks down and says, you know, I'm still right about it. I don't know. I mean, but I mean, I would love to have him sort of like second thoughts about, you know, his Stalinist past.
As a partner of values of learning standards.
You talked a lot about the cosmopolitanism of the memory, and also in a lot of papers that you publish in books, you develop this concept, but mostly related to the politics of states. Today you've mentioned some examples also of memorials, but especially being in this place, what do you see, especially state-owned museums, but museums, not memorials or monuments? How do you see their role in this process of keeping Holocaust memory, but especially in the context of this?
You mean Jewish museums or
in general, not only?
Because, like I said before, I mean, I'm also very impressed by this museum, I have to say. I mean, and because I think right here also this museum tries to do something more than show that the Jews are just like other Poles. They really try to go beyond that kind of simplistic view, and the museum in Skopje, which I found extremely intriguing, because Macedonia was really involved in this struggle with Greece, and there you had a map of, you know, Sephardic Jewry, you know, going from Spain all over to southern Greece, and trying to really see this kind of transnational thinking. Now, what is going on, of course, is that in most museums, and museums are not anymore for art, but museums are now there to create a new kind of memory, and it's mostly national memory. It's bounded memory. It's territorialized. Sort of like the museum is sort of like trying to rediscover its constitutive mode of the 19th century, where territory becomes like the defining feature. You can see this, for instance, very clearly in the Jewish Museum in Berlin, in Germany, where, you know, where it's about really German Jews, with the emphasis on territory and language, and it's completely bounded by space and territory. Now, it's difficult for a museum to do anything else, because a museum is space as well. How can you create unbounded space within a space which is very bounded? And you can do it, you know, with all kinds of interesting new digitalization and all that. I'm not a museum expert, but I mean, it's difficult for museums within states to counteract. I mean, I asked the director of the Jewish Museum in Skopje how he can do that, and he said, you know, we are such a small museum within this context. Nobody has really paid attention to this kind of transnationalism within the museum.
Sorry for being so persistent, but I have another question. Since you mentioned Mark Rothberg and his multidimensional memory, I would like, perhaps, because I'm very impressed by this book, and perhaps it's worth it to underline how important it is to include different memories in my own and what you gain, and how is so to say, more human to include many memories in your own.
Yeah.
Could you develop this?
No, of course. I mean, Michael Rothberg, who's a dear colleague of mine, and his concept of multidirectional memory is very closely aligned to my own concept of cosmopolitan memory, and we have developed it sort of like very much independent of each other. I mean, the major argument of his is, of course, that there's this idea that memory functions as a zero-sum game. Like, too much Holocaust memory takes away from others. And it's that kind of competing memories, like Holocaust and Stalinism. So it's like the more Holocaust memory you have, the less memory you need, you can get for Stalinism, because it's like, it's a very traditional model of energy that is being used in memory studies. And I think what Michael has done, Michael Rothberg has done, and what I sort of like also try to do, is to liberate memory from this traditional model of energy, and to show that it is not zero-sum, that it is sum-sum, and that you can have memories running on parallel tracks without taking away from each other. And you may remember this beautiful chapter in Rothberg's book about the visit of the black sociologist Du Bois or Dubois, whatever, to here. I mean, outside here, to the Warsaw Ghetto Memorial, and he came back and he wrote this beautiful article, which is the Negro at the Warsaw Ghetto Memorial. In those days, you said the word was Negro, and he sort of like introduced this kind of Jewish minority thinking into his own thinking of what it means to be a minority. And Du Bois, for instance, who's of extreme interest to me as a sociologist in these matters, developed this idea of double consciousness. And this idea of double consciousness, which Du Bois has learned from Georg Simmel, which is maybe the most Jewish sociologist in Berlin at the beginning of the 20th century, and this idea of double consciousness, which means that you walk around with two kinds of awarenesses. Sort of, you're being Jewish, you're being human being. How do you sort of like relate to each other, and that you don't have to decide. That you don't have to decide. This is also why Arendt was so impressed by the United States, because she somehow paid attention that when people arrived to America from, let's say, from a place in Galicia, if it's Drohowicz or some other place, and the American immigrant authorities wrote down, you are Ukrainian, you are Polish, and you are Jewish. Sort of like the Jew of Drohowicz and the Pole from Drohowicz entered America, the United States of America, as two entities. No American Jew would say of himself that he's Polish. He would say of himself that he's Jewish. Jewish American. And that Jewish American functions in many ways exactly the same as German American, Italo American, Chinese American, Mexican American, and all this. It's not Jewish American versus Protestant and Catholic American. It's a translation of ethnicity into the American context. And Arendt writes about this in her book on revolution, where she celebrates the idea of American plurality, and where Jews can be Americans and Jews at the same time without having to decide what actually, it's of course also, it's an imagination. It's a picture you have in your head. It's an ideal type, but it's an ideal type which is very much anchored also in social reality. And the relationship between Du Bois, who is a black sociologist from America, who came to Germany, studied with Georg Simmel, the archetypical Jewish sociologist in Germany, went back to America, came then here, was at the Ghetto Memorial as an old man, and developed this idea of double consciousness, which is exactly what I. Please ask me more. I mean, this is like this. I'm getting into the mode, sort of like, of answering you.
My name is Łukasz Mieszkowski. Thank you for the lecture. And I'd like to refer to the final words of it about the transition of the Holocaust memory from the nationalist to universal context, and to the first question asked about the Israeli Holocaust memory. And are those two things are somehow connected? Is it possible that the Israeli Holocaust memory would turn from the nationalistic to universal? Is it happening, or is it just a utopia, or it simply not apply to that?
Look, I mean, you have of course attempts to do that. You have groups who want to do that. But I mean, to answer this in a broader way, you have two documents being published in 1948 within 6 or 7 months. We have the Declaration of Israeli Independence, published in 1948, and there it's clearly written: the catastrophe in Europe happened due to the lack of sovereignty. A couple of months later, and the State of Israel exists in order to provide protection and sovereignty to the Jewish people. A couple of months later, you have in New York another document, which is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. There, in the conscience of the catastrophe which happened, we now declare, basically, the end of absolute sovereignty, symbolized by the notion of universal human rights. So, what you have is the Israeli Holocaust consciousness, which means the problem was lack of sovereignty, and you have another almost detrimental trope of memory, which says the problem of the Holocaust was too much sovereignty, was the sovereignty of a dictatorial state, of a dictatorship, and that's why the international community, what it needs to do is to limit sovereignty of states in order to prevent it. Now, these kind of two tropes are running not towards each other, they're running parallel. So this is also why you have, when you look at this, you have, of course, in Israel, groups, they are marginalized, of course, who would like to try to understand the Holocaust in more universal terms. But they have to do this in opposition to the major, sort of like, to the major hegemonic way of understanding the Holocaust. Now, this is, of course, completely understandable. I mean, as sociologists, I mean, we have to look at this. I mean, there's no way Israel can develop a universal understanding of the Holocaust. If it would be possible, then Israel would be America and not Israel. It's the self-understanding of the Israeli state. It clearly, I mean, the deep structure of its existence, which needs to look at the Holocaust as a trope which existed, which came into place because Israel did not exist. Now, if this makes historical sense or not is a completely other question. it's one of the founding myths of the State of Israel. And that's why you can always have people who can say, we would like a more universal conception. We would like to look at the Armenian genocide as something that we can relate to. And one of the major scholars of the Armenian genocide is Israeli, who is right now teaching a class in Armenia itself on genocide. So you have, of course, Israelis who do that. But there's a distinction you have to draw between Israelis who think that way and the State of Israel, who is sort of like locked into a different kind of thinking. Okay? Or? Okay.
So both the Polin Museum...
I don't see... here, okay.
Sorry. Both the Polin Museum and the Jewish Museum in Berlin, and I suppose also the one in Skopje, are new museums.
Yeah.
Meaning there is some increased interest in the Jewish history as a specific nationality, as well as the Holocaust as a specific Jewish event, to call it this way. So would you say there is a shift in recent years in the European perspective of the Holocaust from a more cosmopolitan event to a more national one? If so, then why?
I don't know exactly why, but you're absolutely right. I mean, the Berlin Museum is a very conservative one. It comes to here. This is much more open space, not only spatially, but also I think what I've seen last time I was here, also intellectually, it has opened up much more space than the Berlin Museum has done. And it might be even the most impressive Jewish museum in Europe, which is, of course, on the other hand, also, I mean, it's a Jewish museum, one of the most impressive Jewish museums in Europe, and there's actually almost no Jewish presence. At the same time, while in Berlin, all of a sudden, you have a large input of Jews coming from Eastern Europe, from Israel, and from many other places. So you have that paradox. You have that paradox as well. But yes, there is of course, and some of it. I mean, these museums are struggling. They're struggling with the idea how to frame it. You know, to frame it nationally, to frame it transnationally, to show that Jews are just like other people, only a little bit more so, as Heine has argued. And or are they like a nation within a nation, as those who argued against Clermont during the French Revolution, who said, you know, these Jews can never be assimilated. You know, they're alien to what we are as a French nation. I mean, this is exactly the debate you have now in Europe regarding Muslim immigration. I mean, are there a nation within a nation? Can they be integrated? Are they really that alien to what is called Western ideals? And I mean, in Germany, this is like, I mean, you just have to open the newspaper every day in the newspapers. This is the big debate. I mean, what can be done? And what is so interesting, especially when these questions are debated in the German context, that the Jews are completely absent as an idea, as history, as something that needs to be referred to in this debate. It's interesting. It's interesting, sort of like that. What is going on?
Hello,
yeah.
Thank you for the lecture.
Okay.
I'm right here.
Okay.
I would like to, I'm struggling with how to frame this question, but I find that there's a huge problem with the view of the discourse of the other and the discourse of minorities in relation to the Holocaust and to the crimes of the Nazis, and I will explain. As we know, I think that there is a growing, that there's a lot of reference to as the the Nazis, the Germans, killed who were the other in their societies, which means the Jews, the disabled, the homosexuals, and the gypsy. But the problem is that, in fact, the Jews were millions. They killed them all over Europe, and the other groups much less, or they didn't. And the Poles, the Ukrainians, the Belarusians that were murdered were also millions, and they were not minorities, not much less in Germany, and not in their own societies. And I think that those millions of Slavic people are just being erased from the memory because of this point of view, and also the Jewish Holocaust is being minimalized because of this. And I would like to know your opinion about it.
But are you sure that this is the case?
I
are
am
you really sure? I mean, who is raising the memory of
Yes.
Ah, okay. Sorry. So it's like I feel like I'm in the university, so I'm moving around all the time. But why do you think that their memories have been erased? Who says that? Why? It's not true. I don't think so.
Well, the question is being erased from where? So it's definitely not being erased in their own countries. But if you take a high school and even a university student from Israel and the United States, and you ask them what groups have the Nazis killed or what groups have been killed in German concentration camps, they will say homosexual and gypsies and disabled much more before they will say Poles, much more before they will say Belarusians and Ukrainians. And also in Israel, definitely.
I mean, what you're mentioning is a problem of school education. It's not a problem of it's not a problem of memory. I mean, that people are ignorant, you cannot refer to that as a problem of memory. When I asked my students, you know, how many people were killed in World War II, some of them answer 6 million. And because this is sort of like this kind of ignorance is being perpetuated, of course. And if you take American high school kids, or Israeli high school kids, or German high school kids, and probably Polish high school kids, and ask them about the Armenian genocide, for instance, I mean, they will say that I have no clue what you're talking about. What are Armenians? Who are they? So what you're saying is that you're sort of like trying to.
But why do they not have no clue? Is it part of the education?
Yes, of course.
Yes,
I mean, this is.
part of
I
the
mean,
museum,
the national educational systems are bad in every country. I mean, we know that as educators. But moreover than that, national educational systems concentrate on circles of the we. The circles of the we are sometimes smaller and sometimes broader. And what you're saying is, why are people not really educated in all the atrocities of the universe? This doesn't work like that.
It's not what I'm saying. Well, the question is why, for example, in Israel, people are more aware, if at all, to the murder of other minority groups and not of other national groups that have sovereign countries like the Poles, maybe because it undermines the idea that sovereignty is what Jews needed.
I don't think so. I mean, this would be very. This is sort of like really assuming a kind of sophistication in the educational system which does not exist. It's much simpler than that. People are just ignorant.
But the question is, why are they ignorant
And the ignorance is not only towards the Poles. I mean, the ignorance is also towards homosexuals, and people have no idea.
There is right now a monument for homosexuals in Tel Aviv, even for most of the homosexuals that were murdered were Germans, but I would not dare to say what would happen if someone would want to make a monument for the Poles in Israel.
But this has to do with the gay culture in Israel itself. This has nothing to do with the educational system. I mean, I agree with your grievance. I don't agree with the assumption of this kind of conspiracy, sophistication in the educational system which does that in order to legitimize sovereignty. It doesn't work like that. The world is not that complicated sometimes.
Thank you for your answer.
Okay. Even though you don't agree with me, but it's okay. I mean, this is what we have.
Last question.
I'm not sure I fully grasp the idea of your lecture, but
I don't.
Well, I hope it's not a problem. But as far as I understand it, you try to make a case for a cosmopolitan view and argue for the benefits that people, humanity, whomever might draw from that. Don't you think that what we're seeing as a result of emancipation and liberation of all kinds is the opposite trend, that people have their particular histories, and also that's because a history is only good and true and authentic, and that's what people want to have if the history speaks from where it's close to, because that's when you get the how you get the audience, and that's how you get the writers of history. And because of this proliferation of many points of views, you have plurality, more than plurality, you have cacophony of voices, and also the whole educational systems in wherever you go, they are not cosmopolitan, they also stem from communities, and communities call for their identities, their ideologies, their fantasies sometimes. And whenever they get in touch and in contact with each other, they rather try to negotiate if they have common interests or if their roots clash, rather than seek for an ideal cosmopolitan view, because it seems like nobody in the whole world wants that. So I'm just wondering, coming back to my first impression, whether you are a lone idealist who is calling for something impossible, or whether you see a light at the end of the tunnel that someone will want to read a history like that.
Thank you. I don't think that this has nothing to do with lone idealization and cosmopolitan romanticism. I completely agree with you that the reaction to transnational ideas is a fallback to community. This is what we see at the moment. This is what Europe is about at the moment that we speak about. The reactions to Brussels, Brussels as the symbol of the European Union, is what you said, community. What I tried to develop here is not a pledge for cosmopolitan memory. What I try to develop here is an alternative point of view which exists and which should not be put away in some kind of like romantic corner. Also, what I tried to develop here is that there is, what you said, a true, authentic, communal Jewish view. And this true communal Jewish view can be exactly that view that transcends space, that transcends time, that can be cosmopolitan and also communal at the same time. So I'm saying that it exists, it's there. It needs to be brought out again. That the Israeli worldview of what it means to be Jewish is one. But next to it, there exist alternative Jewish life worlds. They were destroyed, they were eliminated. And because of the destruction and the elimination, what you have left now is almost no conceptual, intellectual space which exists between assimilation and Zionism. And what I try to resurrect here, sort of like I feel like an archaeologist of memory in that sense. And what I try to resurrect here is that there is space between assimilation and Zionism, which is a Jewish space, which exists somewhere, which has existed very concretely. It existed. It was completely destroyed first by fascism and then by Stalinism. But it exists as an idea. And it exists as an idea maybe more than anywhere else amongst American Jews, of course. But even there, it's much more complicated. And I've said in my lecture that one should not see Jews as a homogeneous bounded community, that there are many views. That what I try to do is to resurrect that view which has been lost from history and memory. Okay.
Thank you very much. I would like, in the end, remind you that the book, the last book of Professor Sznaidera, was translated into Polish. And you can see this book there. And we also have a guest here, the Professor Stanisław Sułowski, who is responsible for publishing this book from the Institute of Political Sciences. So thank you very much. And we invite you, all you, to our and other lectures in this series, all the new questions in Jewish history, which the next lecture will be held by Professor David Beal, and it will be about how the Christianity influence, how did Christianity influence the Jewish culture, and it will be 18th May. Yeah, something like this. In 4 weeks. So you could check on our website. Thank you very much and good night.